This is Kimberley Leonard in the Sky News Daily. More twists in the BBC story today. It's another claim from another individual about the same presenter. And the BBC Director General has given more detail about the original allegation and how the corporation has responded. So, loads to catch up on. Let's start with the latest development, first reported by BBC News. Sadiya Chowdhury has been on this for Sky News. She's outside BBC headquarters in central London. Hi, Sadiya. So what are the new claims?
Hi, Kimberley. These are fresh allegations being reported by the BBC. They say that a young person has told BBC News that they felt threatened by the BBC presenter who is at the centre of this story with the Sun newspaper. A reminder that this presenter is already part of this story where a mother has alleged the Sun newspaper that her child, when they were 17, sent explicit messages to this presenter in exchange for money. Now this new allegation where this individual who is in their early 20s says they were first contacted by this male presenter on a dating app. They say they were put under pressure to meet up but never did. And then they have spoken to BBC News and said that they have no connection to that first set of allegations, the first person who brought those allegations in the Sun story. But they said that they were scared by the power that this presenter had over them, that when they said to the presenter that they know who they are and they may go public with their name, that they received menacing messages from them, very threatening messages. So it's very serious, and it adds to this story where we've already heard very significant and serious and potentially criminal allegations against this presenter.
And BBC News has been very clear how it has verified this, hasn't it? So they've seen the messages.
Yes, the BBC is obviously separate to this. BBC News doing this reporting and say that they've spoken to this person. That would mean that they would have verified their identity. That's a standard procedure that all journalists do when we speak to anyone. But that, not only that, but they've also seen these messages themselves, and they've also checked that that phone number matches that of the presenter. So lots of verification done there, a bit of investigating from BBC journalists themselves, and certainly some people might say much quicker than the BBC's corporate investigative team had done.
And Sadiya, just finally, there has still been no word from the presenter on this new claim.
No, there hasn't. There wasn't with the first set of claims, and there hasn't been from this claim either. We know that the BBC News has contacted the presenter directly and through his lawyer, and they've said that they've received no response to the latest allegations. And a reminder, we still don't know who this presenter is. There's no way for us at Sky News to do any of our own digging on these claims, but BBC News say they've contacted the presenter and they've had no response back from him.
Okay, Sadiya, thank you so much. So that's Sadiya. But before that development was being reported, attention was on the BBC Director General Tim Davie, as journalists asked him questions about these claims. Our home editor Jason Farrell was one of them, and he's been telling me about the BBC's timeline of events.
So first of all, he said that there was a contact made with the BBC. Someone actually went to the BBC building on the 18th of May. They then got in contact with the services of the BBC to deal with complaints on the 19th of May. And there was a phone conversation, which we now know was a 29-minute phone conversation detailing the allegations. And then that was passed through to the corporate investigations team, who deemed it as serious but not criminal. But I'll come back to that in a minute. So then what happens is they say they get lots of these complaints. They have to verify them. So they then send an email back to the complainant, and they said they didn't get a response to that. And then there's a delay until June the 6th. They still haven't had a response, and they make a phone call, but they say that phone call didn't connect. And then subsequent to that, they say that the investigation remained open, but they didn't actually make any further attempts to make contact with the complainant. What we also know is that they didn't contact the person who had been complained about. So at this stage, it's pretty much left open with nothing happening for a month.
And that's back in May.
And that's back in May through June. And then we get to July the 6th, so a month literally after that phone call that didn't connect, comes the Sun allegations. And at this point, on the 7th, they do speak to the presenter. They do reach out to the complainant. The complainant then provides them with further information, and they go to the police. And then the police, after that meeting, say they're not launching an investigation, but they are scoping this out to gather further information to see if there is evidence of a crime. And at that point, because there is police involvement, the BBC have to pause their investigation.
And you asked about the difference between the May claims and the latest claims.
So what interests me, and I think what interests a lot of people, is what was it in the Sun article that was different to the complaint on the 19th of May? Why was it not assessed as criminal then, but it was afterwards? Why was there a suspension after the Sun article, but not a suspension before? So I put that to the Director General, who essentially said that the assessors had looked at it and that they had decided it was very serious, but that they thought that there wasn't evidence of criminality. And I think the problem with that response is that it doesn't just give us that extra detail that we might have wanted. Because let's not forget that the BBC are being accused by the family of lying about this. So when the BBC produced their statement on the weekend saying that there was new information in the Sun of a different nature, the family responded to that saying that's a lie. The family said, we told you about things that you could have worked out were criminal. And I think we can be pretty clear what we mean by that. So what the family had said to the Sun newspaper is that although the individual is now 20 years old, that this dated back 3 years. And the allegations were that the presenter paid a lot of money for explicit photographs. And if that person was 17 at the time, that would have been a criminal offence because they cannot consent to that kind of thing until they're 18 years old. So what the family are saying is, you knew that, we informed you of that, so what's different in the nature? And I think if the BBC were to give a full response to that claim and allegation, they need to say a little bit more than our assessors deemed that it was a criminal. We need to know whether they actually are refuting what the family are saying. And I don't think that we've had a direct response to that.
Okay, what else was asked of Tim Davie on that call? And what did he answer, and what do you think did he not answer?
There were lots of interesting things that were asked, which we did get some answers to. So had he met the presenter at the centre of this and spoken to that presenter? No, he hadn't. He said he was taking up a different role overseeing it. But I think a lot of people will wonder why, if this is a high-profile person, this is a big allegation that's been swirling around the BBC now for a number of days, why hasn't he sought out a version of events for himself? Obviously now he can't because the police have told the BBC to pause. He was also asked whether the BBC had asked for information such as phone records or bank records to try and follow up their own investigation at the time that the presenter was approached, so after the Sun article. And he indicated that that hadn't happened at this stage. So it sounds like it was a preliminary conversation. Now, of course, he was asked, well, what did the presenter say? What did they say about their relationship and the payments and so on and so forth? And he didn't give any answer to that. He felt that that was a private matter, that there was a certain duty of care. And I think that comes back to why he won't reveal information about what came out in this first complaint, that he feels that there is a certain level of privacy that needs to be afforded to this person while these matters are thrashed out.
And in the Sun this morning, more from the young person's mother and stepfather. And again, this person has said through lawyers that their mother's claims are not correct. Were those claims put to Tim Davie?
Not really, actually. No one actually brought up what was said by the young individual through their lawyer. But what was put to Tim Davie in an interview on The World at One was whether he had any information to suggest that the presenter had in any way been involved in paying for that young person to have access to that lawyer.
Do you know categorically that the presenter did not pay for those legal fees? Because that's the suggestion being made by the family.
That is not information that I'm party to.
So you can't even say that that's...
No. I think that's not something for the BBC, bluntly.
OK, or whether the presenter has been in contact with the person at the centre of it.
Indeed.
That's not for the BBC.
There's no suggestion. I don't think anyone can say, oh, that's definitely happened. That presenter has paid for those legal fees. But that's been put out there, and the Director General's been unable to answer that question.
Jason, stay there. We'll come back to you in a second. But also in that press briefing was Jake Kanter. He's the investigations editor for Deadline and a former media editor at The Times. Now, Jake, you asked Tim Davie a question as well, but just tell us a bit more about how that question process actually worked in the meeting and how it compared to previous annual report briefings that you've been to.
Yeah, so I found it quite frustrating. It was a virtual press conference and journalists were only able to ask questions via the chat function on Zoom. This is a relic of the pandemic. The BBC has, for the past few years, organised press conferences around its annual report in this way for very obvious reasons. We were all at home and it was the only way that the BBC could set out its annual report and put up its Director General to speak to media. But I think we should not be in a situation now where that's the case, particularly on a story, on a week where we've got this enormous story. I don't think it's necessarily ideal for the BBC to be vetting questions that its Director General receives. And my hope is that in the future, we will move back to in-person press conferences when the BBC publishes its annual report.
Now, it should have been the day that it was setting out its stall on the corporation being value for money that's trusted and it's accountable. Do you think the Director General stood up to scrutiny today?
Look, Tim Davie is good in these circumstances in terms of handling questions from the press. He's a pretty confident performer. And that goes way back to 2012, in fact, when he was parachuted in as an emergency Director General amid the Jimmy Savile crisis. And it was during that period that he helped steady the ship and stabilise what was an incredibly difficult moment for the BBC. So he's got experience of dealing with really problematic crises. I think, again, we saw a reasonably confident display. The BBC had clearly done a lot of work to establish this timeline. But as I say, the full facts are not at our fingers. And I think it's only with time that we'll be able to properly reflect on how he has handled this situation. What we can say confidently is that he didn't know about the allegations against this presenter until last week, and that probably works in his favour.
And as you say, when Tim Davie was brought in as Director General, his aim was transparency. And if you look at how BBC News has reported this story, would you say they're making efforts to be transparent?
I think there are a couple of things in play for the BBC here. One is quite recent. So the BBC gave wall-to-wall coverage of the Philip Schofield issue. It was leading bulletins. They were doing live blogs on it. And I think if it does not provide coverage that is commensurate with the Philip Schofield coverage, then it opens itself up to questions about holding other broadcasters to standards that it's not holding itself to. And the second thing is the Jimmy Savile scandal. I think that lingers long in the memory of BBC employees and BBC journalists, and they have a record of holding their own leaders to account. And I think we still see the echoes of that in some of the reporting that we're seeing from the BBC today. I think the BBC, look, I was listening to the BBC radio coverage and TV output. There was members of the public commenting on this story. And I think there's a real risk that mistakes could be made. The presenter could be identified. The young person involved in this case could be identified. So the BBC does have to tread carefully, I think, going forward.
Okay, let's talk about The Sun. What do you think it means for The Sun? Their journalistic rigour really being brought into question over this, isn't it? What steps will they have taken, do you think, to check that the story that the parents came to them with was true?
It's very difficult to say. All we have, or certainly all I have, is The Sun's own reporting on this. There are a few clues, I think, in its reporting. It has said more than once that the mother of this individual has signed a sworn affidavit. So there is some sort of official testimony, potentially legal in nature, that the son could fall back on if there were legal proceedings. The second thing that is made clear is that the mother has not requested payment for telling her story. It's been at pains to point that out in its reporting. So that suggests that there's no financial benefit in the individuals blowing the whistle on this issue. But the son is being much more coy about the evidence that it does have or has seen. At no point in its reporting has it said that it has seen bank records, texts, or pictures. It suggests that it may have had sight of some of the dossier that the family has handed to the BBC over the weekend, but we don't know the precise evidence that the son has. And I think the statement by the young person's lawyer to BBC News on Monday raises serious questions about the son's reporting.
Jason, so much has changed since we last spoke, 24 hours ago. We've had so much more information. Where do you think this leaves the BBC now?
Well, it's got a difficult balancing act. And I think it was quite interesting that the World at One presenter said to Tim Davie, in this building, everybody knows who this is, which is quite a striking thing to come from a BBC presenter. So how long can you keep this, under wraps, as it were, without coming out publicly and talking about that?
It's not a sustainable situation, is it?
It is a very difficult and complex situation, and we're trying to calmly and judiciously navigate our way through quite difficult circumstances, where, as I said, you've got to balance duty of care issues, privacy issues. I think I would restate that it is absolutely not the right thing to be doing to speculate some of the malicious stuff online.
Understood.
I would condemn, of course I would. But I, as Director General, have to make those calls fairly and in a balanced manner as we go through the process.
So that's one question for the BBC. But I think looking at the way that Tim Davie's handling this, he's trying to do it in a way that he can look back at it in a year's time or so and say, we got the balance right. We got the balance right between the duty of care for that presenter, who is going to come under an awful lot of scrutiny one way or another by the police, the corporation and the general public. And I think that he's already indicating that there are lessons that will be learnt from this, the flagging system. None of the senior executives within the BBC and the Director General himself knew about these allegations until they were approached by the Sun. So when the original allegations came in, they weren't told about them. And was that the right procedure? When does that information go up the chain? And how high does it go up the chain? And how quickly should it be flagged? So there's lots and lots of questions for the BBC over this. And I think, they'll already be asking those, but they're still in the middle of the crisis. They've still got to get it right from here in.
Okay. Jason, thank you so much for talking to us.
You're welcome.
This episode was produced by Rosie Gillett, Annie Joyce and Alex Eden. Our editor was Paul Stanworth.